the layman name for cruel is the um, the lower leg. This is going to be like where your calf is and all those muscles of your leg that are going to help move your foot. Um, so, yes. Let's move on. So, what name is associated with the ninth region in this photo? So, the ninth region in this photo is on the left side. It's also down here in the hip area. And as we know, the left area in the hip is the left iliac. What name is associated with the first region in this photo? So the first region in this photo is on the right side. And when I think about this term, I think about, so it's in the right hypochondriac. When I think about this term, I think about a hypochondriac. So every time you get a little cough, you think you have pneumonia or you think you're going to die. I'm a hypochondriac. Excuse me. I definitely, I definitely do associate the two terms. So that's how I think about it. I think about you always think you're sick, and you always think you're sick when you have a little bit of a wet cough, a dry cough. Like you think about it, you think you're gonna die. At least I do. So the next one is the layman name for the tarsal is the ankle. Let's move on to the next one. Another name for the front of the knee is also called the, oh, I almost put the wrong one, the patella. What name is associated with the eighth region in this photo? So the eighth region in this photo is way down here. So under the umbilical, which we had talked about. When it's under the umbilical, it's going to be the hypogastric. Another name for the back of the knee is going to be the popliteal. 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 And that's because I associate the popliteal and the patellar. I could not remember the name for a second. They both start with P. Okay, so let's go on to the next question. The plane in green represents a sagittal plane. So a sagittal plane cuts them in left in half, which we already know is going to be blue. So this is false. That is not a sagittal plane. In fact, that is actually a transverse plane because it's going to cut the body into two halves, like top and bottom. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. Question 49. The layman term for plantar is. So the layman term for plantar is going to be the bottom of the foot. And let's move on to the next question. What body cavity is pictured in number 2? So in number 2, we have the dorsal body cavity, which is the combination of the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. It's both of them, so we call that dorsal body cavity. What name is associated to the section labeled A? So A is on the right side. It's the right upper quadrant. Okay, let's move on to the next question. What is the 3 examples of positive feedback? So when we think about positive feedback, It's going to be childbirth, blood clotting, or lactation at 1 out of 10. So it's going to be these because positive feedback is known to intensify the reaction in order to produce more of that reaction, as in regard to childbirth, blood clotting, and lactation. So in regard to childbirth, it's actually proven that childbirth usually results when the fetus is ready to come out. They think they can sustain life outside the cell, the body. The baby's growth is going to take up all the space in the uterus, and that's going to stretch. And these stretch receptors are activated in the uterus at some point, and the brain is going to signal for the release of a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is going to cause those uterine muscles to contract, and contractions will get stronger until the baby is delivered because your body is going to keep producing that oxytocin. It's going to keep trying to contract and squeeze those uterine muscles to get that baby out of there. In regards to blood clotting, it's positive feedback because when you get an injury like a cut, let's say you cut your arm, that cut on your arm causes platelets to arrive at that cut site. So those platelets are going to get stuck, and as they continue to get stuck, those platelets are going to send out a cytokine signal. That cytokine signal is going to cause for more blood clotting because more platelets are going to come and arrive at the site. And this is going to keep occurring until that blood is completely clotted in that area and you're not bleeding anymore. And you get that little scab-like thing. In lactation, obviously, it's mothers know that the more your baby suckles, it's known that the more you produce lactation, and this is due to hormones and other bodily functions. So let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Okay. True or false? Positive feedback intensifies a change in the body's physiological condition rather than reversing it. And that is true. That's what we've been talking about. Blood pH is usually maintained at about it's about 7.4. There is a range. It's we'll talk about it a little bit in the next slide, but there is a range, but it's usually 7.4. So blood pH is maintained at 7.4, but it's a range of 7.35 and 7.45. Very small range, but it's because your blood is it needs a very, very specific atmosphere that is able to perform in, and so yes, it's a very small range. It cannot really go up or down that much. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Body temperature is usually maintained about, I would say it would be about 98.6. So when you go to the doctor is always like, oh, you're 99.5. So everybody's range is different, and just like blood pH, there is a range for bodily temperature. As we can see, it's 97.6 to 99.6, but the average person is about 98.6. So don't freak out if you're 99.5 at the doctor's office because it's a range. It's but anything higher or super lower than that is bad. It's fever. Your body is not at homeostasis. Something is wrong. Something is causing your homeostasis of your body temperature to be off, and that's when there's a problem. Let's move on to the next one. The plane in red represents a frontal or coronal plane. I can never say that word, and this is true because a frontal plane, it's going to cut your body into front and back halves. That's the best way I can explain it. Okay, so let's move on to what name is associated with the third region in this photo. So the third region in this photo is on the left side. It's on the upper region in the ribs. And what do we know about that? That's your hypochondriac region because you get a little cough, your left hypochondriac region. Okay, let's move on to question 60. So in question 60, what anatomical direction is number 1 pictured below? So number 1, we're going from the feet to the head, and in terms of that, we want to look at it and we say, Okay, so we're going from feet to the head. That's the opposite of inferior, so that is going to be superior, which is below. Okay, what name is associated to the section labeled C, and the section labeled C is the right lower quadrant, which is going to be right here. Now let's move on to 62. What anatomical direction is number 3 pictured below? So in number 3, we're going up. So we're either going up to the hands or up to the head, and that's your proximal. Okay, so 63. So in 63, what body cavity is pictured in number 12? In number 12, it's pointing at where the heart would be, and this is going to be your pericardial cavity. I say words too fast and mess them up. What anatomical direction is number 4 pictured below? So in 64, we're looking at the tops of the skin. The tops of the skin is going to be superficial. That's like your skin and things of the sort. So let's move on to 65. Let's get it moving a little bit. We're going a little back in time. Anatomical direction is pictured in number 6. And number 6, we're pointing outward. So we're looking at a lateral view. We're not going in towards medial. We're going out towards lateral, out towards the other limbs, not towards the middle of the body. What anatomical direction is pictured in number 7? So in number 7, we're looking at distal. We're going down, distal, further from. 67. What anatomical direction is number 8 pictured below? So number 8 is going inward, so we're looking at the deep part of the body. Okay, so now let's get into some body cavities. What body cavity is pictured in number 1? In number 1, this is your cranial cavity. This is where your brain's going to be held, some neurons in the brain, some stuff like that. So let's move on to the next one. What body cavity is number 3? So number 3 is what makes up the dorsal cavity. It is your vertebral cavity. Now let's move on to number 70. What body cavity is number 4? So number 4 is pointing to the front part of you, which is your chest or your thoracic. So let's move on. What is number 13 pointing to? So number 13 is pointing to this structure. It's not necessarily an organ, but it definitely helps. This is your diaphragm. It helps with respiration. It helps with it's just a lot of function. It has a lot of functions. It's very crucial. So what body cavity is number 6? So number 6 is pointing at where your abs would be, your abdominal cavity. Okay, let's move on to number 73 because we are definitely running low on time. So what body cavity is number 7? So number 7 is pointing down here. It's pointing down to where your reproductive organs would be, the pelvis. So this is your pelvic cavity. So let's move on to the next one. What body cavity is number 10? So number 10 is pointing to where your the body of your mediastinum would be. And when we look at that, we think of the superior mediastinum because it's the upper part of your mediastinum. Okay, 75. what body cavity is number 11? So number 11 is pointing to where your lungs would be, and your lungs would be in your pleural cavity. So let's go on to number 76. This image shows what kind of metabolic chemical reaction. So when ATP and some components are combined together, that's going to be anabolism. So in regard to that, anabolism is specifically when the building of molecules, especially complex molecules from numerous things, are combined. Like protein synthesis is an example of anabolism. It's when you're going to take smaller components and you're going to combine them together, usually with energy. So let's move on to number 77. True or false? In a negative feedback loop, there is always a sensor, a control center, and an effector. This is true. So in a negative feedback loop, there's always a sensor. The sensor is going to sense the imbalance of homeostasis. It's going to sense like, let's say your body's really hot, so at a very high temperature and you have a fever and it's super hot outside, your body's going to sense that, your sensor receptors are going to sense that. They're going to send that to the control center. The control center is going to make up the decision whether or not to they're like, is this a normal range? No. Okay, let's produce a response to get this back to homeostasis, and they're going to send that response to the effector. The effector is going to be what changes it and brings everything back to homeostasis. Okay, so let's move on. What medical imaging technique usually looks at soft tissue in a brain scan? So usually that is going to be a CAT scan. I said a CAT scan, a CT scan. Excuse me, ignore that. It's going to be a CT scan. A CT scan is usually going to look at soft tissues, and it's usually going to scan the brain, especially to look for damage. What medical imaging technique usually looks for cancer or a foreign body? So that's going to usually be a PET scan. What medical imaging technique usually looks for injuries to the brain and spinal cord? So whenever we think about the brain and spinal cord, we're going to think about MRI, because MRIs are going to look at those components, that spinal cord and that brain, to look for damage to them. And then, what medical imaging technique usually looks at the soft tissue or developing fetus in utero? So whenever you go to the doctor when you're pregnant, your doctor may perform an ultrasound. Okay. What anatomical direction is number 2 pictured below? So number 2 is pointing to the middle of the body, or the medial. Okay, so let's move on. What medical imaging technique looks at bones themselves? Can look at broken bones or issues with their growing. So whenever you get a broken bone, you usually go to the hospital and they will give you an x-ray. '84. This image shows what kind of metabolic chemical reactions when we're taking a component but we're breaking it apart into energy into smaller pieces. That's going to be catabolism. That's when we're breaking a larger molecule or compound into smaller compounds. 85. Does an atom retain any of its properties? Yes, an atom always retains any of its properties. There's a few exceptions when an atom is an ion and things of that such. But usually, yes, they will retain their properties. What is the smallest unit of matter? So the smallest unit of matter, in regards to life, is an atom. The atom has subparticles like protons, neutrons, electrons, protons, obviously. Let's move on because we'll get up later on. I don't want to run out of time. Elements are substances made out of atoms with identical numbers of subatomic parts. So is that true or false? That's true. Let's move on to the next question. In order of most abundant to least abundant, what are the four first elements of the human body? So not Chan. What are they in order of how much it is in the body, from most to least? And that is oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Excuse me. So, there's going to be more oxygen than carbon, more carbon than hydrogen, more hydrogen than nitrogen. So let's move on to the next question so we don't run out of time. What is two or more atoms joined together by chemical bonds? When two or more atoms are joined together by chemical bonds, it's going to be called a molecule. What charge does a protein have? This is why I didn't want to get too into it back then, because protein has a positive charge. They're going to be positively charged, and what charge does the electron have? Electron is known to have a negative charge. Atomic number equals atomic number of electrons. Is this true or false? This is false. It does not equal the number of electrons. It equals the number of protons. Let's move on to the next question. What is the levels of energy called that electrons orbit the atomic nucleus in? So they usually orbit in what is called electron shells. There's other names for them like electron clouds and all that such. But in this case, in this instance, out of all the four options given, we're going to say it was electron shells. But if you hear electron cloud, that's not correct. Next question. So the most outer electrons are called, they have a very specific name, and that very specific name is valence electrons. It's given to the electrons in the outermost shell of the electron shell. What does inorganic compounds not have that make them inorganic? So inorganic compounds do not have carbon and hydrogen. They do not have both of those. I mean, they can have carbon, they can have hydrogen, but they do not have both.